When a young black man is told to return to South Africa by an elderly woman, a routine grocery trip becomes a memorable confrontation. His next statement alters everything. Not simply the room's quiet. The bustle of everyday errands filled the supermarket shop. Customers wheeled their carts down the aisles, some silently conversing, others deep in concentration. It was a bright afternoon in a little Pennsylvania neighborhood where it looked like everyone knew one another. However, the routine's typical flow will be disrupted in the most unexpected way today. An old woman, perhaps in her early 80s, stood near the vegetable area, fiddling with her glasses. Muttering to herself as she reached for a bag of apples, she exuded frustration. She appeared modest due to her worn cardigan and meticulously pinned silver hair, but what transpired was anything but. Reaching for a bag of oranges nearby, a tall, unpretentious young black man in jeans and a green hoodie walked up to the same stand. Terrence was his name. He was composed, courteous, and appeared to fit right in with the store's operations. It happened while he was juggling a cart of shopping and texting on his phone. The old woman's countenance changed when she turned abruptly and saw Terrence. Her lips were pursed and her eyes squinted, and it wasn't subtle. She said, "You people don't belong here," loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. With his fingers hovering over his phone, Terrence froze. She went on, her tone cutting and piercing as he looked up. "Why don't you go back to South Africa where you came from?" The air appeared to get denser. A few shoppers in the area froze in place. Some looked at one another uncomfortably, while others pretended not to hear. The store's rhythm stopped, and an uncomfortable silence that lasted far too long took its place. Terrence's first reaction was one of disbelief. His brow furrowed, and for a split second it appeared as though he might speak out right away. However, he didn't. Rather, his countenance was unreadable as he inhaled slowly, as if considering all the possible answers. Still holding on to her apples, the woman remained firm and unrepentant. Everyone within hearing distance could sense the strain. While an elderly man near the potatoes looked anxiously at Terrence, waiting to see what he would do, a young woman swiftly led her toddler away. The ensuing stillness, which established the tone for what would happen next, was heavier than any words. Terrence stayed motionless for a while, his hand clutching the handle of his shopping basket. Every sound in the store felt muffled, and every face turned toward him, as if the world had shrunk around him. Like a foul stench from which no one could get away, the weight of the woman's remarks lingered in the air. The old woman remained firm. Her posture was belligerent, as if she expected no resistance. Her chin was up in a manner that challenged him to answer, and she huffed as she straightened her cardigan. A few feet away, a teenage worker was stacking bananas when he halted in mid-strategy, uncertain whether to intervene or remain out of the way. To gain a better look, a cashier craned her neck. Whether they liked it or not, they were now witnesses. The encroaching mob did not approach, but they also did not depart. Terrence looked at her, his eyes full of thinking, but his face composed. His mind was racing with 1,000 possible answers. He could scream, lash out, or run away, but none of those things seemed right. Instead of cracking under the weight of the anxiety, he gave himself a time to catch his breath. He moved his basket to his other hand and stood up straight, his presence becoming more noticeable in the quiet. When he did speak, it was cool but purposeful, breaking the uneasy silence. He said, "Ma'am," in a measured tone, "do you even realize what you just said?" His inquiry was contemplative rather than accusatory, as if he wanted her to consider what she had said. However, she showed no interest in introspection. "I said what I said," she yelled, raising her voice. "This is my nation. Individuals such as yourself have no place here. That was it." The faint murmur of the throng became louder as a young woman by the bread aisle let out an audible gasp. Terrence, however, stayed composed. He didn't speak louder or move closer. Rather, he allowed the silence to lengthen, allowing her words to become ingrained in everyone's ears. "All right," he murmured, nodding slowly at last. The power of his composure was disarming, almost unnerving. "Let's talk about that since you brought it up." The room waited for his answer, holding its breath. No one had anticipated the type of storm that was on the horizon. Terrence carefully placed his basket on the floor after shifting his weight. Even others who pretended not to pay attention were drawn closer by his composure, which seemed like gravity. Instead of looking at her with rage, he looked at her with a quiet resolve that caused her to shift uneasily. He started, "You said I don't belong here," in a firm but calm voice. "But let me tell you something about where I come from." Every word he spoke had weight, as if he had picked them carefully. He paused just long enough for the words to register. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Greenville," he added. "He worked land he didn't own as a sharecropper, breaking his back to provide a better life for his children. He was abducted, abused, and sold like property since his father was a slave. For what purpose? To aid in the development of the nation in which you are standing." The woman's mouth tensed, but she remained silent. But the audience was enthralled. A man who had been looking at his phone near the dairy area put it down completely. An elderly couple didn't turn away as they whispered to one another. "My grandfather," Terrence went on, his voice growing stronger, "fought in World War II, fighting for a nation that sent him abroad to risk his life and then treated him like garbage when he returned. Unable to use the same fountains or sit at the same counters. However, he remained. Do you know why? Because even when this nation didn't trust in him, he still believed in its promise." The room became quiet. Even the sound of the freezers appeared to have subsided. He continued, "And my parents," his voice softer but no less passionate, "they fought too, not with guns or fists, but by working every day, teaching me to believe in hard work, kindness, and respect. As a teacher, my mother has dedicated her life to assisting children of all backgrounds. If your car broke down, my father, a mechanic, would pull over on the side of the road to help someone like you." With his gaze firmly fixed on hers, he paused to allow the words to sink in before continuing. "So you're telling me I don't belong here? That I should go back to South Africa?" He gave a small shake of his head, and there was now a trace of melancholy in his voice. "Ma'am, I am as much a part of this country as you are, maybe even more, because my family paid the price for it in blood, sweat, and tears." The old woman's hands shook a little as she gripped her apples, and her face flushed. As though to reply, she opened her mouth, but her words caught in her throat, and she paused. Remaining composed, Terrence stepped back. "I could have walked away," he added, turning to face the audience. "But what sense would that have? Silence doesn't make ignorance go away. It is our collective responsibility to rise above this and to surpass such statements." The narrative was far from ended, but the impact of what he had spoken remained. Nothing would be heard more clearly than the response of the throng. Terrence's statements were followed by an almost deafening quiet. Nobody moved for a second. Anger, humiliation, and a deeper emotion that appeared to be shame were all mixed together on the old woman's face. She looked about as though she was looking for an ally, but there were none. A man in his middle years wearing a baseball cap came forward. "He's right," the man remarked, disturbing the silence with his voice. "We've got to be better than this." A spell seemed to be broken by his remarks. An elderly woman nodded close to the frozen food section. She continued, "My dad fought in that same war," in a quiet, shaky voice. "He always said the only color that mattered was the red on the flag." The whispers grew louder. "I've never seen anyone handle something like that so gracefully," a young cashier, no more than 25, exclaimed from her station. "Thank you." The old woman gripped her cart fiercely, clearly agitated now. The fire in her eyes had gone out, but she didn't apologize. When it did come, her voice was softer, almost begging. She began to say, "I didn't mean," but stopped herself. Terrence's face softened as he turned back to her. Gently, "It's not about what you meant," he remarked. "How it came across is what matters. Words are important, but actions are even more important." The tension was gradually reduced by a clap from a man behind the deli counter. At first there was hesitation, but as more people joined in, the sound grew stronger and more indisputable. People applauded Terrence's statements as well as the bravery it needed to face hatred head-on. Before silently rolling her cart toward the exit, the elderly woman took one last, pallid look around. A few others shifted to console Terrence as she left. He was touched on the shoulder by a woman who said, "Thank you for saying what needed to be said." With a slight smile, Terrence returned his basket to his grasp. Sometimes, he continued, almost to himself, it's about making sure people hear the truth, not about winning or losing. The tension in the air gradually gave way to a sense of introspection as the crowd began to thin out. Everyone appeared to have changed in some way, whether it was via inspiration or thoughtfulness. Even though the moment was past, Terrence's remarks left a lasting effect. What followed would be remembered for a long time. The mood in the grocery store changed as people went back to their daily routines. It became more subdued and contemplative. With deliberate steps, as though he was taking in all that had just transpired, Terrence completed his shopping. He had not been startled by the gravity of the situation, but it had caused him to think. The young cashier, who had raised his voice earlier, smiled shyly as he scanned his products at the checkout line. She paused before continuing. What you said back there meant a lot. Individuals don't usually rise to the occasion in such a graceful manner. Terrence returned the smile, his voice warm. Sometimes grace is the only way to break through. Anger just builds walls. As Terrence made his way to his car, the sun was already starting to drop outside, creating lengthy shadows across the parking lot. He saw the old woman seated in hers, her hands clenched over the steering wheel. He briefly considered approaching her, but changed his mind. He had already spoken what needed to be said, and some lessons take time to sink in. Terrence and his father sat at the kitchen table later that night and talked about what had happened during the day. His father, who rarely spoke, listened carefully while folding his hands on the table. At last, his father responded, "You did the right thing, son, not only for himself but also for everyone else in the room. She may not change right away, but you planted a seed in people like her. Sometimes all you can do is sow the seed and watch it grow." With his father's comments ringing true, Terrence nodded. Even though the encounter had been awkward, he understood that it was essential. Silence simply permits ignorance to fester. Ignorance cannot be changed unless it is faced. The old woman sat at her dining table across town, gazing at the unfinished dish of food. She kept hearing Terrence's remarks, each one piercing the barrier of her presumptions. For the first time, she experienced a new feeling as she considered her own grandkids in the world they were growing up in. Doubt. The community began to hear about what had transpired in the grocery shop in the days that followed. Terrence's response, his bravery, and his dignified handling of the issue were all discussed. It evolved from an event into a lesson, a reminder of the significance of speaking up for what's right and the power of words. Although Terrence didn't want to draw attention to his acts, they had unanticipated effects on the community. Gratitude-filled strangers came to him to tell their own tales of discrimination and tenacity. Conversations that had long been avoided had been triggered by his silent stance. Even the old woman started to alter. Though it took some time, she began to doubt the convictions she had long maintained. She hoped she would have the guts to apologize if she ever saw Terrence again, but she wasn't sure. These kinds of moments serve as a reminder of the courage, generosity, and truth that can triumph over ignorance. They show us that speaking up doesn't always mean yelling. It may also mean speaking with conviction and composure while allowing the truth speak for itself. Let this serve as a reminder to everyone in attendance that your words and deeds count. They have the power to harm or to heal, to split or to come together. Please remember to share, like, and subscribe if this story touched you. By working together, we can make the world a better place by spreading messages of courage, understanding, and hope.